Maximus is in the line of thought that you can already find in Plato that sees evil as necessarily dependent on ignorance, and specifically ignorance of God, or you could say the good in earlier parlance. And that's for a few reasons. One reason would be that if God is the good, and you could fully know God without any element of error or ignorance or distortion, and you could still resist or not want God, then that would make God not the ultimate object of your own will, your rational will. Another way to put it would be to say God wouldn't be the beautiful, the compelling, the source and fulfillment of all of your hopes and dreams and desires if you could fully know God as He is and still say, actually, no, I don't want you. Most of the time, if we don't think we want something that's good, it's because we don't really know or believe that it's good for us. But seeing something is good for you, or seeing something is beautiful, or seeing something is lovely, seeing it and wanting it, or loving it, or desiring it, or recognizing it, they're all one and the same thing. And so if you could see God, who is supposed to be the good, the beautiful, love itself, fulfillment of all possible desire itself, because He's the source of all possible desire. If you could see God and know God fully and reject Him, you wouldn't be, he would be insufficient to fulfill your own desires. And so in some sense, wouldn't be the source of your desires, so that your will would be, as it were, something like not His full creation. Like there's something in you that resists God because it's almost as if God is alien to that thing. And what is that thing? It would be created by something else or come from some other place. But if God really is the one true source of all true rational desire, then knowing God and loving God are one and the same thing. Maximus argues that at length in Ambiguum 7. But then the flip side of that would be then that if you don't, a lot of people say, like, even like when Socrates says at the end that I don't think the truly good man could ever be really harmed, people are like, oh my gosh, what is this weird idealistic? It's a similar point, he's just making it a different way. That you would love virtue even if it causes you physical harm, because you realize that true happiness isn't in physical happiness or pleasure, it's in actually maintaining your character or virtue, clinging to the good. Well, that tradition is in the Greek fathers as well, it's in Maximus. But I think the common retort to that whole way of thinking about evil is, well, hold on a second, like it looks to me like a lot of people choose evil all the time and they know that, so they're guilty of that, and so it seems just obviously wrong to say people only choose evil and choose to sin in ignorance. No, they know what they're doing and that's why they're to blame, etc., etc. I think the response to that would be, other than the one we've already said, which was, well, if that were ultimately true, like in a final way, then God would prove to be insufficient as the fulfillment of all desire, and so not really truly the source and perfection of our own happiness, which sounds kind of problematic. But the other thing is actually, and this is where Maximus kind of, I think, like the rubber meets the road. He thinks that actually even if you know what is right, like what you kind of are supposed to do, maybe call it your conscience or whatever, and you still sin against it or you go against it, there still is a more troubling, because deeper, unbelief in that thing as the true good or the right way for you or something you should do. So if I like see somebody, let's just take the Good Samaritan, the famous parable, and you see somebody in need and you pass by on the other side, you might think that, well, those people are to blame precisely because they knew what the right thing was to do and they chose not to do it. Well, that's true. But them choosing not to do what is right probably comes from a deeper deception about what they think is good for them. So in other words, they might think, well, and this is where you generate excuses and justifications for not doing what you think you kind of know you ought to do. Well, actually, I've got other reasons not to do this. And giving myself in love and in mercy, even if it costs me or is sort of costly to me, or I have to sacrifice for it, really isn't the best thing for me to do. It's better for me to pass on the other side for this, and this reason. So actually, there is deception at work, even in your choosing. Blameworthy, yes, you're still guilty and blameworthy, sure. There's still some degree of culpability because you have some knowledge of what you should do, but you don't have the truest, substantial knowledge of what you should do. Because if you did, you wouldn't even think about it. You wouldn't hesitate whatsoever. You would just cling to it as the true good for you. So I only ever sin because I don't fundamentally believe in God as much as I might think I do. I only ever sin or do evil because I don't fundamentally believe Jesus when he says, if you want to gain your life, you must give it away. And whoever, clings to his life will lose it. I don't really believe that. And so I want to do things that'll keep me safe or promote my well-being or survival, even if that means compromising ethically on this or that or that or that, or not being compassionate or whatever, right? So it's a self-deception. I don't really believe. I think that's Maximus's. So he has this moment where he says that ignorance is the mother of all vice. And so that's what I'm getting at here, is that ignorance for him is the fundamental condition. It's not the sufficient condition. I'm not saying that's automatically, if you're ignorant, you're automatically going to do evil things. It's a fundamental instability. What in another context, Maximus will call the gnomic will, right? The will which has to deliberate because it's not totally sure always what's good and bad for itself, or where God is, or what God wants in any given situation. It's also, by the way, why he comes to say that Jesus, even in his human will, does not have a gnomic mode of willing, a deliberative, unsure one, but what he calls a natural will. That true freedom wouldn't be one where you hesitate because you're uncertain about the good. True freedom is one in which you don't have to hesitate whatsoever because you see the good clearly and in total knowledge, right? And in knowing the good, you love it. And in loving it, you desire it. And in desiring it, you do it. So ignorance, the whole point of all this is just different ways to say that for Maximus, ignorance has to be there, or else sin wouldn't even be conceivable. Evil wouldn't even be conceivable. But that's not sufficient. What you also need is a positive self-deception. One way to think about it is this. Whether or not we tell ourselves that we're doing this, we're always interpreting everything. Part of what it means to be a rational creature is that you're always assigning reasons, even if it's not well articulated or you haven't reflected on it very much. But even when we react to something, it's because we're immediately telling ourselves a story about what's going on. All right, so-and-so cut me off in traffic, so I'm angry. Well, you might be angry like that in a split second, but you wouldn't be angry unless you already are interpreting the events as that person just wants to do something because they don't care about me. And since they don't care about me, and maybe they're really selfish and they don't care about anyone, they just cut me off. And since they cut me off, I'm going to get angry. So your emotion, your passion is already a reaction which is assuming an interpretation, a view of the world, right? For example, you might not even consider maybe that person cut you off because they're rushing to the hospital because somebody's in their back seat needing assistance right now, vitally, or they're going to die. Now, that might not be true, but it's possible. And we just have to, in the quick split second, you've chosen a different interpretation of things, right? And so it's not just ignorance about what's going on. I'm not sure what's good, what's bad. It's also sort of positive ignorance about what's happening right before you, even in what you're reacting to in the moment. And what you're reacting to in the moment is already dictated by the way you're viewing everything, from yourself to what's happening before you, to who you truly are, to who God ultimately truly is and what he is like, to what this world really is and what it's for, where it came from. The whole thing, we don't think about this hardly ever, but the whole thing is a complicated interpretation or story that we tell ourselves about the world, God, and ourselves. And it's only in that rational context, this picture of the world, which is a story or an interpretation, that we're reacting and acting in it. And so that Maximus, one way to refer to that, Maximus will talk about is like fantasies, fantasia in Greek, like pictures that are intellect. It's a explanatory pictures of the way things are. And so it's not just ignorance that you need You also need an actual interpretation of the world, which, because it's wrought in ignorance, it could be more or less accurate, but will almost always be slightly wrong, erroneous, mistaken. And so you have but insofar as it's a mistaken view of the world, another word for that is just a deception. But what we do is, since we can't help but act according to how we interpret everything, what you do when you act is try to actually bring about, or to realize, or you might say to incarnate, the very picture of the world that you have imagined to yourself. So if you think you're really, really important, maybe we call this the vice of pride or something, you think you deserve all kinds of respect, you think you deserve people to move out of their way, bend over backwards to serve you, to give you compliments, or whatever it is you think. And if that doesn't happen, you're going to react in such a way that you want to make that the way things are, right? You want to say, no, I deserve this. So you're going to tell me this, or no, you're going to give me my respect. So you're trying to make the world conform to your image of the world. You're trying to make the world conform to your image of yourself. You're trying to make the world conform to the image or interpretation you have of God. And so every act is an act of incarnating or bringing into being, embodying a vision or a fantasy of the world. The fantasy could be correct. That's where, through faith and through, for Maximus, ascesis, through the liturgy, through scripture, through the tradition, you get an accurate picture of the world, and you try to incarnate that picture into the world. That's the true world that you're trying to bring about with God's grace. But sin then is bringing about within the world, you're trying to sort of mangle it into a false world according to your false deception picture of the way things are. So that's like the second element. You move from ignorance generally to a positive sort of guess in an attempt to force or embody or bring about or realize that picture of the world into being. And that is what for Maximus constitutes evil. So he agrees with the tradition of privation, the theory of evil, that evil is not anything in itself. He says at one point he lists all of Aristotle's categories and says evil has none of it. Evil has no essence, it has no quantity, it has no quality, it has no relation, it has no place, it has no, he even says it has no hypostasis of its own, like subsistence. So he agrees that with that evil in and of itself is nothing. But that's the whole absurdity of evil. It's not just that evil is nothing, but it's a nothing that through our own self-delusion, we try to make something. We try to make into something. And that produces what he and Origen, by the way, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, all of them call these certain phenomena then are quote, works that are not of God, not created by God. These are what I referred to earlier as like these pseudo-existences, which, along with his theory of divine judgment, have to be destroyed because they're false. They're deceptions which you have sort of given your own life to. So that's another descriptive word that Maximus uses of evil, is parasitic, paraupostasis, which is like it's not, doesn't have its own hypostasis, it doesn't have its own subsistence, but it uses your life through your own freedom, your own consent, and through your own actions trying to bring about this deception. It's like it takes your own life and being and reality, and that you get, it's like an act of self-sacrifice for the sake of evil. You give of yourself literally in order to try to bring this evil about, and you sort of partially succeed. You make it an extension of yourself. St. Gregory of Nyssa maybe would have used the image of a warts, right? Warts on the soul that in judgment have to be cauterized. But and they depend on the skin, like warts do, in order to exist, but they're really mangling the skin, or they're blotching it, they're blemishes, they're not truly what the skin should be, but they use the skin like parasitically almost to gain subsistence or draw life from. So same, different image, but I think the same idea working there. And Maximus thinks that we do that with evil. So his theory of evil, I think, is complicated then, because you've got ignorance, you've got the fantasies, which can be easily self-deceptions, And then you've got the enacting or the false incarnating of these deceptions, which then bring about or produce these kind of false creations, these false incarnations, these pseudo existences, this parasitic existence. And that has to be dealt with because they still are phenomena. In other words, they still are things you encounter in life, like realities that appear. That's the word phenomena. They still appear to you. And a lot of the spiritual life is learning how to discern between the appearances and say, what, just because something is appearing to me doesn't mean it's real or fully real. And so you have to discern what is real, what is not, or more often, probably, how much of this appearance is real and how much is contaminated by deception or fantasy. And that, of course, starts with ourselves, in prayer and sort of, Lectio Divina or whatever you do, in meditation and contemplation. Part of what you're doing is not just trying to see greater or higher realities, but also see false realities as false. And so it's working through various appearances that come to us in many different forms and from different directions to try to decide what is truly a work of God that I should contribute to, and what is not a work of God that I should resist, and actually, in that sense, cooperate in God's judgment against it, to destroy it, to deprive it of life, so that the true life can come forth.